Blumenthal, you're recognized for your questions.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to you and to the ranking member for having this hearing. You know, we attend a lot of classified briefings, and I would say at the end of probably more than half of them, I say to the briefers, often very high-ranking members at the Pentagon or in the intelligence community, you know, our adversaries know we know what you've just told us. We know our adversaries know that they know we know. We know they know we know. The only ones who don't know are the American people. And very often, it is information that is vital to the American people assessing a threat to our national security. And if I began to tell you now what those subjects are, I'd get in a lot of trouble. Nobody would shoot me, but I would be, in effect, shot on the floor of the United States Senate. It would become a major issue. Blumenthal discloses classified briefing. So the real losers here are the American people, not about some historic event 25 years ago, but about current threats to our national security, where we could mobilize more support publicly for defense spending in certain areas if the American people knew what the ongoing threats are. And sometimes, and I'm going to be somewhat adventurous here, the information we get is from aerial surveillance, where companies in the private sector are already producing the information because they got satellites just like our military does. And I have seen aerial surveillance of the balloon that went over our country, the Chinese balloon, which traces it back to when it originated, not from the Pentagon, but from a private company doing the same kind of aerial surveillance. The present system is beyond broken. It is actually counterproductive. It promotes secrecy at the expense of our national interest and security simply to prevent often embarrassment to public officials who would prefer that the public not see what they are doing. And we all would love to be the final arbiters of what the public knows about what we're doing, but it doesn't happen that way in a democracy. And I've seen the history here. You go through it in your testimony. Nothing has happened after every one of these commissions. Nothing. None of the Moynihan recommendations adopted. So when we sort of preach here, meaning we on the panel preach, not you, it really is not necessarily a sign that we're going to accomplish something now. But I would like to take some of these recommendations, for example, from the Moynihan Commission, and propose them in a more comprehensive way rather than piecemeal in the way that we've adopted doing it. I don't know that it would require another commission. But I'd like to know from you if you were to prioritize 5 recommendations made by the Moynihan Commission or by one of the other numerous bodies that have made recommendations, what would they be? And I know we won't have time necessarily to go into all of your suggestions or recommendations, but it would be helpful, I think, to get the 5 things, taking Senator Paul's apt remark that the experts are here. We don't need to form a commission with you folks on it, but something really ought to be done. And the American people want an end to this secrecy for all the reasons that have been stated in a very forceful bipartisan way. So, I'm happy to begin going down the line. We'll run out of time, and so your written responses, I think, would be very helpful.
I'll try to be quick because I know all of us are going to have ideas. And I was looking at the list that I had, the summary of the recommendations that I made in my written testimony, and I had basically 10 sets of recommendations. So I was just choosing the top 5. But certainly I think we need to start with technology development and implementation of advanced technologies. You're not going to find that in some of the older commission's reports, but it is key to the success of the system now. I mentioned in my oral remarks that we should have a White House-led task force to narrow the criteria for classification, that we should require agencies to have accountability systems for overclassification. I think that's very important. There are other ways as well to rebalance the incentives that I mentioned in my written testimony. And then reforming automatic declassification by empowering the National Declassification Center to declassify documents without lengthy agency review, but also to include what's called a drop-dead date. This is what Tom was speaking about earlier. It's a sunset, which is a period of time after which documents would simply cease to be classified. They wouldn't have to be declassified. And then the last one is that I think Congress should amend the provision of the National Security Act that talks about protecting against the unauthorized disclosure of sources and methods, because that provision has been misconstrued to allow and even require the withholding of sources and methods regardless of whether their disclosure would actually harm national security. So those are my top 5.
I totally agree, and I could stop there, but I would just add the top recommendation of the Moynihan-Helms-Combest Commission was for Congress to pass a statute to authorize the classification system and take that away from the executive orders that just make a mishmash of the whole thing. A statute, and then in that statute, the core principles of that statute need to be what Liza just said, that any withholding of any kind, not just classified area, but in the unclassified areas that Senator Paul's talking about, executives should have to identify the harm from release and have a balance test against the benefit from release, cost-benefit analysis, harm test. And to come back to my own testimony, sunsets on the front end will compel better thinking by the original classifiers because they got to make a risk assessment that right now is just a drop-down menu. Oh, want to go to lunch? Oh, is that secret or confidential or, right? That's all it is, a drop. It's as reflexive as the old days when it was a rubber stamp, except it's a drop-down menu. So a statute and then those balancing pieces on the front end and on the back end. I think that's the core.
Very briefly, I would suggest attention to one of the recommendations the PIDB made in an earlier report around prioritization. While we are working on capabilities that can deal with data and paper and digits in the aggregate, something needs to be done now, or one thing that can be done now is for the Congress to use its voice to indicate what the public interest is, right? In the ways that Patrick was talking about with the JFK assassination records. It does not have to be as an auspicious and historical event as that, but if there's one that hasn't been addressed, put that out there as a priority for the NDC and the agencies to work on, to show a good outcome for the classification system. Prioritization is a difficult challenge, but I think a necessary one for separating the wheat from the chaff that's in the 600 million pages of unreviewed documents and other big piles. Thank you.
In my written statement, Senator Blumenthal, I have essentially model legislation that would do an awful lot of what Tom and Liza are talking about. So I agree with Dr. Paul. If you put the 4 of us in a room over a weekend, we could probably give you a pretty nearly finished version of what you might want to take a look at. So I'll leave it at there.
Well, and we will we'll be continuing to work. We're working with all of you so far. We're going to continue to work with you so we get something done. So we'll make sure that happens. I need to step away for another committee hearing briefly to ask some questions downstairs. Ranking Member Paul will take the gavel until I return.